Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Mister. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video story. It all started the summer after I graduated high school. Money was tight, and I needed a job. When my friend Dave told me about an opening at Henderson's gas station, I wasn't thrilled. It wasn't the most glamorous gig, and it had a bit of a reputation in town. Stories of weird customers, strange noises at night, and things disappearing without explanation. Henderson's wasn't your typical gas station. It sat at the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to stretch endlessly. The nearest building was miles away, and the only sounds at night were the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Despite the eerie location and unsettling rumors, I needed the money. The night shift paid a little extra, and I figured I could handle a few oddities. After all, what could really go wrong in a gas station, right? My first few shifts were uneventful. I stocked shelves, cleaned up after customers, and manned the register. The station was in a remote area, so the nights were mostly quiet. But as the quiet stretched on, it began to feel oppressive. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was the kind that made you feel like you were being watched. It was a Tuesday night, and the clock had just struck midnight. I was scrolling through my phone, half watching the security cameras on the monitor, when something caught my eye. The camera feed for Pump 3 flickered. Static filled the screen for a moment before it came back online. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, but then I noticed a figure standing by the pump, a tall, shadowy figure wearing what looked like a long coat. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring directly at the camera. Great, a drunk or a prankster, I muttered, grabbing my flashlight. I stepped outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. The figure was still there, but something felt off. "Hey!" I called out, my voice steady. "The station's closed for maintenance. You'll have to come back in the morning." No response. I took a step closer, shining my flashlight toward the figure. The beam cut through the darkness, but instead of revealing a face, all I saw was nothing. No features, no details, just an empty void where a face should have been. My stomach dropped. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I stood frozen. The figure tilted its head slightly as if studying me. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked into the darkness, disappearing beyond the glow of the station lights. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking as I called Dave. "Dude, you won't believe what just happened," I said, recounting the encounter. Dave laughed. "You're just spooked. That place does that to people. It's probably some homeless guy messing with you." I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew this was something else. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of the fluorescent lights made me jump. And then, around 3 a.m., I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the storage room in the back. Grabbing a wrench from under the counter, I made my way toward the sound. The door to the storage room was slightly ajar, the flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The scratching stopped. I pushed the door open, expecting to find a raccoon or maybe a stray cat. Instead, I found rows of shelves, untouched and undisturbed. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A message scrawled on the wall in what looked like soot or ash. "You're not alone." The next night, I was ready to quit. But I needed the money, so I dragged myself back to the station. Around 2 a.m., a truck pulled up. The driver, an older man with a grizzled beard and a worn-out cap, came inside to pay for gas. "You all right, kid?" he asked, noticing my pale face and jittery movements. "Yeah, just tired," I replied, trying to sound casual. He nodded but didn't leave right away. Instead, he leaned closer and said, "You know about this place, right?" "What do you mean?" "The stories. People disappearing. Weird stuff happening. This station's got a history." Before I could ask more, he tipped his hat and left. His words lingered, though, planting seeds of paranoia that only grew as the night wore on. That same night, I went to restock the coolers. As I opened the door, a blast of cold air hit me. I stepped inside, shivering as I placed bottles on the shelves. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow moving behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The cooler was empty. But as I turned back to the shelves, I saw it again, this time right in front of me. A dark, shapeless figure standing just inches away. I stumbled back, tripping over a crate and landing hard on the floor. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just loomed over me, its presence suffocating. I scrambled out of the cooler, slamming the door shut behind me. The shadow didn't follow, but I could feel it watching me, waiting. The final straw came on my last night. I was sweeping the floor when the front door burst open. The air grew icy, and every light in the station flickered violently. I grabbed the wrench again, my hands shaking. "Who's there?" I yelled. The door swung shut, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, from the far corner of the station, I heard a low, guttural growl. The shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. It didn't walk. It glided, its faceless void locked onto me. I ran to the office, locking the door and barricading it with a chair. The lights in the office flickered, and I could hear the growling outside, louder and more menacing. Then the whispers began. The whispers weren't in any language I could understand. They weren't even words, really, just low, guttural murmurs that seemed to seep through the walls. Covering my ears didn't help. The sound wasn't coming from outside the office. It was in my head, gnawing at my sanity. "Leave me alone," I screamed, my voice cracking. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It was the kind of silence that presses against your chest, makes it hard to breathe. Then I heard it, a single knock at the office door. Knock, knock. "Who's there?" I stammered, clutching the wrench like it was a lifeline. No answer. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, until the knocking started again. This time, it was more urgent, louder, and relentless. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I stood there, trembling, when the overhead lights flickered back on. The growling was gone, the whispers were gone, and the door was unlocked. I didn't unlock it. I spent the next few hours huddled in the office, waiting for sunrise. When the clock hit 6 a.m., I grabbed my things and bolted for the door. As I stepped outside, the first rays of sunlight lit up the station. For the first time all night, I felt like I could breathe again. That's when I saw him. A man was standing by pump 3, the same pump where I'd first seen the shadowy figure. He was wearing a long coat, and his face was turned away from me. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky. The man turned slowly, and my blood ran cold. His eyes, or rather the empty voids where his eyes should have been, stared right through me. I dropped my bag and stumbled back into the station, slamming the door shut. But when I peeked out the window, he was gone. That was it for me. I didn't even bother to officially quit. I just stopped showing up. When the manager called to ask why, I told him the truth. He didn't seem surprised. "You're not the first to say that," he said with a sigh. "This place has a way of getting under people's skin." I asked him why he didn't just shut the station down. He didn't answer. After quitting, I couldn't just leave it all behind. The memories refused to fade, and I felt a compulsive need to understand what had happened. My curiosity was a curse, but I couldn't help myself. I started digging into the history of Henderson's gas station, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain the terror I'd experienced. The station had been built in the 1970s by a man named Richard Henderson. According to local records, Richard was an ambitious entrepreneur, but his business ventures always seemed to fail. Henderson's gas station was his last attempt to make something of himself. At first, the station did well, but then strange incidents began to occur. Employees reported hearing voices and seeing shadowy figures in the woods surrounding the station. Customers complained about feeling uneasy, as if they were being watched. A few even claimed to have seen strange symbols carved into the trees near the parking lot. Then, in 1982, something happened that changed everything. A teenage girl named Emily Carter disappeared. She was last seen at the gas station, and her car was found abandoned at Pump 3. Despite an extensive search, Emily was never found. Her disappearance was the first of many. Over the years, more people vanished, always under similar circumstances. The station became infamous, but for some reason, it never closed. No matter how many employees quit or how many customers avoided it, Henderson's gas station remained open. I couldn't ignore the mention of symbols carved into the trees. On a bright Saturday afternoon, I decided to visit the woods near the station. It felt foolish, venturing into the place I'd sworn never to return to, but I needed closure. The woods were dense and eerily silent, even during the day. The only sounds were my own footsteps crunching through the underbrush and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. After about 10 minutes of walking, I found them. Strange, intricate symbols carved into the bark of several trees. The carvings weren't random. They looked like they were part of a ritual with patterns that seemed to flow from one tree to the next. I took pictures with my phone, hoping to analyze them later. As I stood there, examining the symbols, I felt it again. That oppressive silence, that sense of being watched. I turned around, half expecting to see the faceless figure from my night shift. But there was nothing. That night, I uploaded the photos of the symbols to a forum dedicated to the paranormal. Within minutes, I received a reply from someone claiming to know what they were. "These are warding symbols," the user wrote. "They're meant to trap something, to keep it contained." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. "Trap what?" I typed back. The reply came almost instantly. "Something ancient, something dangerous. If the carvings are damaged or incomplete, it can escape." I looked at the photos again. Some of the symbols were faded, their edges worn away by time. "Do you know where these are?" the user asked. I hesitated before replying, "Yes." "Why?" "You need to stay away. If the containment fails, it won't stop at the station." Against my better judgment, I decided to go back to Henderson's one last time. It was a terrible idea, but I needed to see if the carvings around the station were still intact. I arrived just after sunset, the woods cloaked in shadows. The gas station was exactly as I remembered it, silent, lifeless, and foreboding. I circled the building, flashlight in hand, searching for more carvings. I found a few, but most were so faded they were barely visible. Some had been scratched out entirely, as if someone or something had deliberately tried to erase them. As I stood there, a sudden chill ran down my spine. The air grew heavy, and the familiar hum of the station's fluorescent lights flickered to life. I turned toward the pumps and froze. The shadowy figure was back. It stood by pump 3, just like before, its faceless void fixed on me. But this time, it wasn't alone. Shadows began to emerge from the woods one by one until a dozen figures surrounded the station. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figures didn't respond. Instead, they moved closer, their forms shifting and distorting like smoke. The whispers started again, louder this time, filling my head with a cacophony of unintelligible voices. Desperate, I ran toward my car, but the engine wouldn't start. The dashboard lights flickered and the radio crackled with static. Then I heard it, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I don't remember much about how I got out of there. Somehow, I managed to start the car and speed away, the shadowy figures disappearing into the darkness as I fled. When I got home, I locked every door and window, turned on every light, and stayed awake until morning. I haven't been back to Henderson's gas station since. Even now, I don't fully understand what happened. Were the symbols really keeping something contained? And if they were, has it escaped? I've read more about the land the station was built on. Some say it was a sacred site, a place of power that was desecrated when the station was built. Others believe it's a gateway, a thin spot between our world and something else. Whatever the truth is, one thing is certain. Henderson's gas station is no ordinary place, and if you ever find yourself driving through my hometown late at night, do yourself a favor. Keep going. It was a cold October night in 2017. I'd just finished a long shift at work and decided to visit my parents, who lived in a small town about 3 hours away. The drive was supposed to be uneventful, but I underestimated how exhausted I was. About halfway through, I realized I'd forgotten to fill up on gas before leaving. The needle was dangerously close to E, and I was surrounded by empty stretches of farmland with no stations in sight. Panic started to creep in as the low fuel warning chimed repeatedly. Finally, as I rounded a bend, I saw it. A flickering neon sign glowing faintly in the distance. It read, "Gas, open 24 hours." Relieved, I pulled into the lot. The station was ancient. Run-down pumps, cracked concrete, and a single dim light buzzing above the entrance. There was no sign of any other cars or people, but at that point, I didn't care. I just needed gas. I parked by the pump and got out, but something about the place felt off. The air was still, almost unnaturally so, and the night was eerily quiet. As I tried to insert my card into the pump, I realized it was an old model that didn't take cards. I'd have to go inside. The door creaked loudly as I stepped into the station. The inside was as dilapidated as the outside. Shelves lined with dusty cans of soda, expired snacks, and faded postcards. Behind the counter stood the attendant. He was an older man, wearing a dirty uniform and a cap pulled low over his eyes. His expression was blank, his movements slow and deliberate. "Need gas?" he asked in a flat, monotone voice. "Yeah," I replied, handing him a $20 bill. As he rang me up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't him. It was the building itself, like the walls were alive. Just as I turned to leave, the man spoke again. "You shouldn't be out here this late," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I paused, my hand on the door. "Why not?" He didn't answer, just stared at me with unblinking eyes. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, and I hurried back to my car. As I pumped gas, I noticed something strange. There were no signs of any other businesses or houses nearby, just the gas station, sitting alone in the middle of nowhere. And then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, coming from the edge of the lot. I turned toward the sound, squinting into the darkness. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling some loose debris. But then I saw them. Figures standing just beyond the circle of light cast by the station's lone bulb. They were tall, their shapes distorted and wrong, as if they weren't quite human. Their movements were jerky, almost glitch-like, as they shifted closer to the edge of the light. My heart was pounding as I jumped back into my car, locking the doors. The gas pump clicked, signaling it was done, but I couldn't bring myself to get out again. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped fully into the light. Its face, or lack thereof, made my stomach drop. It was blank, featureless, like a mannequin. It tilted its head as if studying me, before raising a hand to tap on my window. Sped out of the station, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The highway stretched ahead of me, empty and unwelcoming. About 20 minutes later, the road narrowed, flanked by dense woods on either side. My headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the shadows seemed to dance at the edges of my vision. I tried to focus on the road, but a growing sense of unease gnawed at me. Then, out of nowhere, something darted across the road. A figure, humanoid but unnaturally fast. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the asphalt. My car skidded to a halt, and my breath came in short, panicked gasps. The figure was gone, vanished into the woods. I sat there for a moment, trying to convince myself that it had just been an animal, a deer maybe. But deep down, I knew better. I was about to start driving again when I heard it. The tapping sound was back, louder this time. It was coming from my rear window. Slowly, I turned to look. There it was, a faceless figure, its blank visage pressed against the glass. Its hands were splayed out, leaving smudged prints on the window. It tilted its head as if studying me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. Slamming my foot on the gas, I sped down the road, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally saw the lights of the diner, it felt like a lifeline. I pulled into the lot, parked haphazardly, and stumbled inside. The waitress behind the counter looked up, startled. "You okay?" she asked. I told her what had happened, my voice trembling as I recounted the events. She listened intently, her expression growing more and more serious. When I mentioned the gas station, she froze. "You said it was on Route 89?" she asked. "Yeah," I replied, confused. Her face turned pale. "That station burned down years ago. There's nothing there anymore." The highway stretched endlessly, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the sprawling emptiness. I hadn't planned on being out so late, but delays had pushed my departure past sunset. Now, the once bustling road had turned into a desolate expanse, illuminated only by my car's faint headlights. The low fuel warning had been blinking for the past 20 miles, a quiet but persistent reminder of my oversight. My anxiety grew with each passing minute, compounded by the eerie stillness of the night. Not a single car had passed me in either direction, and the trees lining the road seemed to loom closer with every mile. Just when I was about to resign myself to the idea of being stranded, I spotted the gas station. As I pumped gas, the night seemed to close in around me. The trees at the edge of the lot swayed gently in the breeze, their branches casting long, skeletal shadows. That's when I heard it, the tapping sound. It was faint at first, like the rhythmic patter of raindrops, but the sky was clear, and the sound was too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced around, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from the far side of the station, where the light barely reached. Squinting into the darkness, I thought I saw movement, a fleeting shadow that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The only response was the rustling of leaves. I finished pumping the gas as quickly as possible, my hands shaking. Climbing back into my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced toward the station one last time. The attendant was still behind the counter, but he wasn't looking at me. Instead, he was staring at something outside, his face pale and stricken with fear. I didn't wait to find out what had him so unnerved. Pulling out of the lot, I hit the road, my eyes darting nervously between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. The highway was even darker now, the trees on either side creating an almost tunnel-like effect. My headlights barely illuminated the road, and every shadow seemed to writhe and shift as though alive. After driving for about 20 minutes, I noticed something strange. The air inside the car felt heavier, colder. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw it. A smudge on the passenger side window. It was faint, but unmistakable. A handprint. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the car's interior. The seat beside me was empty, but the handprint was still there, fresh and glistening as though someone had just pressed their palm against the glass. My fingers trembled as I locked the doors and resumed driving, my eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. A figure was sitting in the back seat. The figure was faceless, its smooth, featureless head tilted slightly as if observing me. Its hands rested on the seat, long fingers tapping rhythmically against the upholstery. I let out a scream and swerved wildly, the car fishtailing before I managed to regain control. When I glanced back, the figure was gone. But the nightmare wasn't over. As I sped down the road, the tapping sound returned, louder this time. It was coming from the roof of the car. Panicking, I pressed the accelerator, the engine roaring as I pushed the car to its limits. The tapping grew more frantic, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. Up ahead, I spotted the faint glow of neon lights. It was a diner, its sign flickering weakly against the darkness. Desperate for help, I pulled into the lot and bolted inside. The interior was eerily silent. The tables and chairs were coated in a thin layer of dust, and the air smelled of decay. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing. There was no response. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. A shadow darted past one of the windows, followed by the unmistakable sound of tapping on the glass. I ran back to my car, my pulse racing. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was outside was trying to get in. As I fumbled with the keys, a voice whispered in my ear, cold and raspy, "You can't escape." I turned around, but there was no one there. When I finally managed to start the car, I sped away without looking back. The tapping stopped, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Later, I learned the truth about the gas station. It had been abandoned for years after a series of mysterious disappearances. Some said it was cursed. Others believed it was a gateway to something far worse. Even now, I don't know what I encountered that night, but one thing is certain. I'll never stop at an isolated gas station again. If you ever find yourself driving alone at night and you see a gas station that feels wrong, trust your instincts. Some places are better left forgotten. The night was as black as ink, swallowing everything beyond the pale glow of my car's headlights. My knuckles tightened on the steering wheel as the low fuel warning chimed for the third time in 10 minutes. Panic gnawed at the edge of my thoughts. I hadn't seen another vehicle for miles, let alone a gas station. The desolation of the highway was unsettling, stretching endlessly through a sea of dense pine trees. Their branches, twisting and gnarled, loomed like skeletal arms reaching for the car. The highway itself was a cracked and faded ribbon of asphalt, devoid of streetlights or even reflective markers. Every few minutes, my headlights would illuminate a stray road sign, bent and faded, its words barely legible. The isolation was absolute, and my phone had lost service hours ago. Just as the fuel gauge dipped into the red, a flickering light emerged from the distance. Relief washed over me when I realized it was a gas station. But the relief was short-lived. The station was unlike any I'd ever seen. The building looked old, far older than it should for a station still in operation. Its neon sign buzzed weakly, the letters barely forming the words gas and mart. The pumps were rusted relics, their surfaces mottled with peeling paint and streaks of rust. A single light flickered above the station, casting long, shifting shadows across the gravel lot. I pulled into the lot, the crunch of gravel under my tires the only sound in the oppressive stillness. No other cars, no movement, just the faint hum of the sign and the dim glow spilling from the station's windows. I hesitated before stepping out of the car. The cold night air hit me like a slap, its bite sharp and unnatural for a summer night. The unease that had been simmering since I spotted the station deepened. My gut told me to drive away, to risk running out of gas rather than step foot in this place. But logic won out. I had no choice. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the faint jingle of a bell announcing my arrival. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic. The lighting was dim, the bulbs above flickering intermittently. The station was cluttered and disorganized, with shelves sparsely stocked with dusty snacks, faded cleaning supplies, and outdated magazines. A single cooler hummed in the corner, its glass fogged over, hiding its contents. Behind the counter sat a man, or something that resembled one. He was gaunt, his skin stretched tightly over sharp cheekbones, his eyes, sunken and shadowed, fixed on me as I entered. He didn't blink, didn't move, just stared with an intensity that made my skin crawl. A thin smile tugged at his lips, but it felt wrong, like it was painted on. "Need gas?" he asked, his voice a low rasp that sent a shiver down my spine. Yeah, pump 3, I replied, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. The man moved with unsettling slowness, his long fingers tapping against the counter as he processed my payment. When he handed me my change, his hand lingered for just a moment too long. "Careful out there," he said, his tone almost mocking. I forced a nervous laugh and hurried back to the car. The sense of being watched didn't leave me until I was safely inside, the lock clicking into place. As I pumped the gas, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, The night seemed unnaturally quiet. No chirping of crickets, no rustling of leaves, just the faint hum of the gas pump and the eerie glow of the station's lights. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping sound, faint but deliberate. It seemed to be coming from the far side of the station where the light barely reached. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I dropped the nozzle and climbed back into the car, locking the doors and starting the engine. The tapping stopped as soon as I turned on the headlights, but I caught a glimpse of something in the darkness, a shadow darting out of view. I didn't wait to find out what it was. Pulling out of the lot, I sped back onto the highway, my eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. The drive felt endless, the dark forest pressing in on either side. My nerves were already frayed when I noticed it, a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by the shadows. As I passed, he turned to watch me, his head tilting unnaturally as he followed the car's movement. I didn't stop. A few miles later, I saw him again. The same figure, standing in the same position, his faceless head turned toward me. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't possible. I pressed the accelerator, my car roaring as I tried to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. But no matter how fast I drove, the figure appeared again and again, always watching, always waiting. The tapping started again, this time from the roof of the car. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the wheel, trying to keep control as the sound grew louder, more frantic. Then it stopped. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. My headlights caught something in the road ahead, a shape lying sprawled across the asphalt. A deer, maybe, or some other unfortunate animal. I swerved to avoid it, the car skidding wildly before coming to a stop. My heart pounded as I sat there, trying to catch my breath. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. The figure was there, standing just a few feet behind the car. I screamed, slamming the car into gear and flooring the accelerator. The figure didn't move, but as I sped away, I could feel its presence, its gaze burning into me. When I finally reached the safety of a brightly lit truck stop, I collapsed in the parking lot, my body shaking with adrenaline and fear. The other patrons gave me strange looks, but I didn't care. I never saw the figure again, but I'll never forget its faceless form or the relentless tapping. To this day, I avoid driving at night, and I'll never stop at another isolated gas station. Some roads are better left untraveled. Some places are better left unseen. There's something about driving at night that sets your nerves on edge. The empty roads, the hum of your car's engine, and the endless darkness stretching beyond your headlights. It all creates a strange isolation that's both calming and unsettling. I've never been the type to believe in the paranormal, but one night, on a solo road trip, I experienced something I still can't explain. It was supposed to be a straightforward drive. I was moving to a new city for work, and I'd planned the trip meticulously. Everything I owned was packed into my old sedan, and with a playlist of my favorite music and a thermos of coffee, I figured I'd drive through the night to save time. I've always preferred the quiet hours on the road, fewer cars, fewer distractions. But the further I drove, the lonelier the highway became. I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest on both sides of the road, when I realized my fuel gauge was dipping dangerously close to empty. Panic bubbled in my chest as I scanned the horizon for any sign of civilization. I cursed myself for not stopping at the last rest area, but at the time, I thought I could make it to the next town. The highway was eerily quiet, with no other cars in sight. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and every shadow seemed to twist and writhe just beyond their reach. Then, as if summoned by sheer desperation, a dim light appeared in the distance. It was a gas station, an old, weathered building that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a 1950s postcard. The sign above the station read, "Station 66, in faded, peeling letters, and a single bulb cast a sickly yellow glow over the pumps below. The place seemed out of time, like it had been forgotten by the modern world. Relief flooded me as I pulled into the lot, but that relief was short-lived. The pumps were ancient, the kind with dials instead of digital screens, and there were no visible card readers. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to go inside the convenience store to pay. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and I was immediately hit by the smell of mildew and stale air. The interior was dimly lit, with rows of dusty shelves stocked with outdated snacks and faded magazines. Behind the counter sat a man who looked as ancient as the gas station itself. He was thin and pale, with sunken cheeks and a gaunt frame. His gray hair was slicked back, and he wore a flannel shirt that seemed several sizes too big for him. A cigarette dangled from his lips, its ash threatening to fall at any moment. "Help you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "I need to fill up," I said, trying to sound casual. "How much for a full tank?" "Cash only," he replied, not taking his eyes off me. I fumbled through my wallet and handed him a few bills, feeling his piercing gaze follow my every movement. He didn't say another word, just nodded and gestured toward the pumps. The air outside felt colder than it should have for a summer night, and the silence was oppressive. As I pumped the gas, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced back at the store, but the man was no longer behind the counter. The lights inside flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the gas station's light. My heart skipped a beat. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its silhouette barely distinguishable from the trees. I stared at it, frozen in place, until the pump clicked, signaling that my tank was full. I quickly replaced the nozzle and climbed back into my car, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure had moved closer. It was now standing in the middle of the road, directly under the flickering light of the gas station sign. Its face, or what should have been its face, was featureless, a blank void that seemed to absorb the light around it. Panic surged through me as I floored the gas pedal and sped down the highway. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A shadow darting across the road, a flash of those featureless voids staring back at me. The highway seemed endless, the trees on either side blending into a dark blur. I tried turning on the radio to calm my nerves, but all I got was static. The white noise only made the silence more oppressive, and I turned it off, focusing solely on the road ahead. Then my headlights caught something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. But when I looked again, the road was empty. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before cautiously continuing forward. But the unease never left me. It felt as though the darkness itself was alive, pressing in on me from all sides. When I finally saw the lights of a small town, I felt a surge of relief. I pulled into a motel and checked in, eager to put as much distance between myself and that gas station as possible. But even in the safety of my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I dreamed of the figure, its blank face staring at me, its long limbs reaching out to pull me into the shadows. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, and I knew I couldn't stay. The next morning, I decided to retrace my route, determined to find that gas station and prove to myself that it was real. But when I reached the spot where it should have been, there was nothing there, just an overgrown lot, with no sign of pumps, a store, or even the cracked pavement. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that something unnatural exists on that stretch of highway, and I'll never take a shortcut through the woods again. If you're ever low on gas in the middle of nowhere, think twice before stopping at a station that feels out of place. You might not be able to leave as easily as you arrived. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.